The year was 1600. After nearly 2 years of a disastrous voyage, a battered Dutch ship was struggling across the Pacific. Her name was Liefde, and she was carrying a handful of men who had survived one of the most brutal journeys imaginable. The expedition had begun in the Netherlands in June 1598. 5 ships had sailed toward the Far East, hoping to establish trade and return with valuable goods. But storms, disease, hunger, and exhaustion slowly destroyed the expedition. Ships disappeared. Men died. And by the time the Liefde reached Japanese waters, only a few sailors were still strong enough to move. Then, on April 11th, 1600, land appeared on the horizon. Japan. For the exhausted crew, it should have been a moment of salvation. Instead, nobody knew what awaited them. The following day, they approached the coast near Bungo. Almost immediately, Japanese boats surrounded the strange European vessel. Curious locals climbed aboard, and the weakened sailors allowed them to enter because they were in no condition to resist. But soon, the crew discovered that their visitors were taking whatever they could carry. The ship was being stripped of valuable possessions. The sailors could only watch. Eventually, the Liefde was moved into a safer harbor, while news of the foreigners was sent to the highest authorities. The crew believed reaching Japan had ended their nightmare. They were wrong. They had survived the ocean, but they had entered a completely unknown country. And before long, someone would accuse them of being pirates. That accusation would place their lives in terrible danger. For several days, the surviving sailors remained under watch. They could not communicate properly with the local people. They did not understand Japanese laws, customs, or politics. Most importantly, they had no idea what the authorities intended to do with them. Then, a group of Portuguese arrived. Among them was a Jesuit who understood the region and could communicate with the authorities. His words would change everything. The Portuguese claimed that the foreigners aboard the Liefde were not peaceful merchants. They were pirates. According to the accusation, these strange Europeans had crossed the oceans to rob and attack other nations. The story spread quickly. Suspicion turned into hostility. The sailors, already weak and frightened, suddenly found themselves surrounded by people who believed they were criminals. And the consequences could be horrifying. In Japan, crucifixion was used as a punishment for certain serious crimes. The crew began to fear that they might be executed. Among them was an English navigator named William Adams. He had survived the terrible voyage, but now he faced a danger he could not navigate around. The Portuguese continued providing information against the foreigners, attempting to convince the authorities that allowing them to live would threaten Japan. Then, 9 days after the ship's arrival, an extraordinary order came. The country's most powerful ruler wanted to see Adams. He was taken away from his companions and placed aboard a Japanese galley. Adams was leaving the ship without knowing whether he would ever return. His destination was Osaka. There, the ruler himself would decide what should happen to the foreign sailor. Adams had crossed thousands of miles of ocean to reach Japan. Now, for the first time, he was heading directly toward the man who could decide whether he lived or died. William Adams finally arrived at Osaka. He was brought into an extraordinary court, where the wealth and grandeur were unlike anything he had previously experienced. But Adams had little time to admire his surroundings. He was standing before the most powerful ruler in Japan. The ruler studied the foreign sailor carefully. Questions were asked, but communication was difficult. Adams understood only fragments of what was being said. Then someone arrived who could speak Portuguese. At last, Adams had a way to explain himself. The ruler wanted to know where Adams came from and why men from such a distant country had traveled all the way to Japan. Adams explained that he was English and that his country had been searching for routes toward the east. Their purpose, he said, was trade. European merchants wanted goods from distant lands, while their own countries possessed products that might be valuable in Asia. Then came another question. Did England have enemies? Adams answered honestly. Yes, England was at war with Spain and Portugal. The ruler continued questioning him about religion, geography, and the journey itself. Then he asked how Adams had managed to travel so far. Adams had an answer: a world map. He showed the route taken by his expedition, including the passage through the Strait of Magellan. The ruler was astonished.
The idea that these men had traveled around the world seemed almost unbelievable. For hours, Adams continued answering questions. The interrogation lasted until near midnight. Finally, Adams asked whether his countrymen might be allowed to trade in Japan, just as the Portuguese and Spanish did. The ruler answered, but Adams could not understand the response. Then came an order he never expected. He was to be imprisoned. After surviving years at sea, William Adams had reached Japan alive. Now he was behind bars, and he had no idea whether he would ever leave.
Then, after 41 days, he was summoned again. Adams was brought before the ruler. This time, something completely unexpected happened. He was asked whether he wanted to see his countrymen. Adams answered immediately, yes. He desperately wanted to know what had happened to the men he had left behind. The ruler ordered that Adams be released. For the first time in weeks, the Englishman was free. He quickly took a boat toward the Liefde. When he finally reached the ship, he was met by an emotional sight. His companions had believed he was dead. They thought he had already been executed. Now Adams stood before them, alive. But the reunion brought another shock. The ship had been stripped of almost everything valuable. Their books, instruments, clothes, and other possessions were gone. Adams had escaped death, but their troubles were not over. When Adams returned to the Liefde, he discovered how badly the ship and crew had suffered. Their possessions had been taken. Clothing, books, navigational instruments, and other valuable items had disappeared. For men who had already endured starvation and disease, the loss was devastating. But there was something even more surprising. The ruler had not authorized the theft. When he eventually learned what had happened, he ordered the stolen property to be returned. Unfortunately, much of it had already been scattered. Some items had been taken to one place, others somewhere else. Recovering everything was almost impossible. So the ruler ordered compensation to be given to the foreigners. A large amount of money was provided to replace what had been lost. For Adams and his companions, it was an extraordinary change. They had arrived in Japan almost penniless. They had feared execution. Now they had official protection and compensation. But their greatest problem remained. They wanted to leave. They wanted to sail away and continue toward the world they knew. Instead, another order arrived. The Liefde was to be moved toward the eastern part of Japan, known as Kanto. The journey was long, and the crew had no choice but to obey. They eventually reached the region near Edo. Adams began making requests for permission to leave Japan. He wanted to find a way to reconnect with European traders. But uncertainty surrounded the ship. Would they actually be allowed to sail? Or had Japan become their permanent destination? The crew began to lose hope. Then another crisis exploded. Several sailors turned against the captain and Adams. Arguments became more serious. Some wanted to leave the ship. Others wanted control over the money. The expedition was breaking apart, and Adams was beginning to realize something frightening. The journey home might never happen. The sailors had spent years fighting to survive. Now, strangely, their greatest enemy was no longer the sea. It was each other. Arguments spread throughout the crew. Some men wanted to leave Japan immediately. Others wanted to remain. Money became another source of conflict. The compensation received from the Japanese ruler had to be divided, and everyone believed they deserved their share. Eventually, the money was distributed according to each man's position, but the division did not restore unity. The crew scattered. Some men chose their own paths. Others remained connected to the ship. The once grand expedition that had begun with 5 vessels was now reduced to scattered survivors in a country thousands of miles from Europe. And there was another problem. The men were being told that they might not be allowed to leave Japan. For Adams, this was difficult to accept. He had not crossed the world intending to settle in Japan. He had wanted to return home. He wanted to see England again. He wanted to reconnect with the life he had left behind. But the Japanese ruler had begun to recognize something important about Adams. The Englishman knew things that few people in Japan understood. He knew how European ships were designed. He understood navigation. He knew the geography of distant lands. He understood the rivalries between European powers, and he could explain how European merchants operated. This knowledge made Adams valuable, very valuable. The ruler could have allowed him to leave. Instead, he began giving Adams responsibilities. The foreign sailor who had once been a prisoner was becoming an advisor, and Adams slowly found himself trapped in a strange situation. The more useful he became, the less likely it was that he would ever be allowed to leave. Japan had first taken away his freedom. Now, it was offering him something even more dangerous. A reason to stay. William Adams had entered Japan as a suspected pirate. Now he was becoming a source of knowledge for the Japanese court. His greatest advantage was experience. He had traveled across enormous oceans. He understood winds, navigation, maps, ships, and maritime routes. He knew how European vessels were built and operated. To the Japanese ruler, this knowledge was extremely valuable. Japan was surrounded by water, yet the wider world beyond its shores remained unfamiliar. Adams could explain what existed beyond the horizon. He could describe European countries, their rulers, their wars, their religions, and their ambitions. He could explain the differences between the English, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese. He could also describe the routes European ships used to reach Asia. Slowly, the relationship between Adams and the ruler changed. The man who had once been imprisoned was now being consulted. Adams also became involved in shipbuilding. The skills that had helped him cross the Pacific were now being used in Japan. This was an extraordinary reversal. A foreign sailor who had arrived aboard a damaged vessel was helping Japanese authorities understand Western maritime technology. But Adams still dreamed of home. Every new responsibility made that dream more distant. His life in Japan was becoming permanent. The ruler trusted him. His knowledge was useful. And the longer Adams remained, the more deeply connected he became to his new surroundings. Yet there was another reason the ruler needed him. European powers were competing for influence throughout Asia. Portuguese and Spanish interests were already established. Dutch merchants were looking for opportunities. The English were also interested in Asian trade. The Japanese ruler wanted to understand these foreigners before allowing them greater access, and Adams could explain their intentions. He was becoming more than a sailor. He was becoming a bridge between Japan and Europe. But that bridge would eventually carry Adams himself into a completely different life. William Adams' transformation was becoming extraordinary. The man who had once feared execution was now trusted by Japan's most powerful ruler. His knowledge of ships and foreign countries continued to make him valuable. But his relationship with the Japanese court went beyond business. Adams gradually received privileges and property. He was no longer treated as an ordinary foreign sailor. He was becoming part of Japanese society. Then came the most remarkable change of all. Adams received samurai status. The English navigator who had arrived aboard the Liefde had become a Japanese samurai. He was also given a Japanese name, Miura Anjin. The name reflected his role as a navigator or pilot. His new identity represented how completely his life had changed. Years earlier, he had been a stranger whose fate depended on a ruler's decision. Now he held a respected position within that ruler's world. Adams also built a family life in Japan. He married and became deeply connected to the country. Yet he never completely forgot England. His homeland remained across the ocean. The people and life he had known there were now separated from him by thousands of miles. Still, Japan had become more than a place where he was stranded. It had become his home. Adams' knowledge also made him important in foreign relations. He understood European trade. He knew what merchants wanted. He understood the competition between European powers, and he could explain the potential dangers of allowing foreign interests to become too powerful. This was especially important because trade, religion, and politics were often closely connected in the European expansion across Asia. Adams could see those connections clearly. He had lived inside that world. Now he was helping Japan understand it. The former prisoner had become an advisor. The sailor had become a samurai. The outsider had become part of the society that once frightened him. But his greatest role was still ahead. He would help create connections between Japan and European merchants, and his past would make him uniquely suited for the task. William Adams stood in a unique position. He was English by birth, but he was living inside Japanese society. He understood European ambitions, yet he also understood the Japanese court. That made him extremely valuable. European nations were competing fiercely for access to Asian markets. Portuguese and Spanish merchants had already established influence. The Dutch wanted greater access. The English wanted it too. Adams understood their differences better than almost anyone in Japan. He knew how European traders thought. He understood their ships and commercial interests, and he could explain their intentions to Japanese authorities. For Japan, this was useful information. For Adams, it was an opportunity to help people from his own part of the world. He wanted English and Dutch merchants to have access to Japanese trade. His involvement helped strengthen the connection between Japan and European commerce. The man once accused of being a pirate was now helping establish peaceful commercial relationships. But Adams' position was not without danger. Japan's rulers were becoming increasingly cautious about foreign influence. William Adams stood in a unique position. He was English by birth, but he was living inside Japanese society. He understood European ambitions, yet he also understood the Japanese court. That made him extremely valuable. European nations were competing fiercely for access to Asian markets. Portuguese and Spanish merchants had already established influence. The Dutch wanted greater access. The English wanted it too. Adams understood their differences better than almost anyone in Japan. He knew how European traders thought. He understood their ships and commercial interests, and he could explain their intentions to Japanese authorities. For Japan, this was useful information. For Adams, it was an opportunity to help people from his own part of the world. He wanted English and Dutch merchants to have access to Japanese trade. His involvement helped strengthen the connection between Japan and European commerce. The man once accused of being a pirate was now helping establish peaceful commercial relationships. But Adams' position was not without danger. Japan's rulers were becoming increasingly cautious about foreign influence.
European merchants did not always come alone. Missionaries also traveled with them, and religion had become deeply connected to European expansion. The Japanese authorities watched carefully. Adams understood the danger. He knew that a misunderstanding could have serious consequences. So he had to balance two worlds. He could not simply behave like an Englishman in Japan, nor could he forget where he came from. His life had become a constant negotiation between his past and his present. England was his birthplace. Japan was his home. Europe was the world he understood. Japan was the society in which he now lived. And Adams became a bridge between them. But bridges can be dangerous places. They connect two sides, yet they belong completely to neither. Adams was beginning to experience that reality. He had found safety and influence in Japan, but he had also lost something precious: the freedom to simply return home. Years had passed since Adams first arrived in Japan. His life was now almost impossible to recognize, compared with the desperate sailor who had stepped ashore in 1600. He had survived imprisonment. He had escaped execution. He had gained the ruler's trust. He had become involved in shipbuilding, trade, and foreign affairs. He had received samurai status. He had built a family, and Japan had become his home. But the past never disappeared completely. Adams still remembered England. He knew his homeland was thousands of miles away. He knew that returning would be difficult. And as the years passed, the distance became more than geographical. His life was now rooted in Japan. His family was there. His property was there. His responsibilities were there. His influence existed within the Japanese court. Leaving all of it behind was no simple matter. At the same time, Adams' importance continued to grow. His understanding of foreign powers made him an important source of information. He could explain European politics. And maritime affairs. He could advise on ships and navigation. He could help Japanese authorities understand foreign merchants. But Adams' position required caution. Japan was becoming increasingly concerned about foreign religious and political influence. European countries were competing for trade and power. The Japanese government wanted to control that influence rather than allow foreigners to shape the country's future. Adams had to move carefully through this political environment. His survival depended not only on his knowledge, but also on his ability to maintain trust. The same country that had once imprisoned him could still punish a foreigner who crossed the wrong boundary. Yet Adams continued his work. The sailor who had arrived with almost nothing had become a man of status and influence. His journey had taken an unexpected direction. He had sailed toward Japan, hoping to trade. He had arrived fearing death. And now he was living a life he had never planned. The greatest irony was becoming clear. The man who once desperately wanted to escape Japan was slowly becoming someone who belonged there. William Adams had gained something extraordinary in Japan. But every great transformation has a price.
His price was the life he had left behind. England was still his birthplace, but it was no longer his everyday world. His family, responsibilities, and connections were now in Japan. The ocean that had once represented adventure had become a barrier separating him from his homeland.
Adams had not planned any of this. His original mission had been about trade. The expedition was supposed to reach Asia, establish commercial connections, and eventually return. Instead, almost everything went wrong. Ships disappeared, crew members died. The Liefde barely survived. The survivors reached Japan in terrible condition. Then came accusations of piracy, then prison, then the threat of execution. Yet every disaster had somehow pushed Adams toward another stage of his life. The ruler's decision to spare him gave him a chance. His knowledge of navigation gave him value. His understanding of Europe gave him influence. His usefulness created trust. And trust transformed him into a powerful foreign advisor. Adams could now explain the world beyond Japan to the Japanese court. He could discuss European trade and politics. He could contribute to shipbuilding. He could help create commercial connections. But he was no longer simply a sailor waiting for his next voyage. He had become part of something much larger. His story also revealed how unpredictable history can be. A single decision in a Japanese prison had changed the course of his entire life. If the ruler had accepted the Portuguese accusations, Adams might have died anonymously in Japan. If he had been executed, nobody would remember his later achievements. Instead, he survived. And survival gave him the opportunity to become extraordinary. The man who entered Japan as a stranger eventually became one of the most remarkable foreigners in Japanese history. But Adams' story was moving toward its final chapter. The sailor who had crossed the world would not cross it again. His journey had ended far from the land where it began. And when death eventually came for him, Japan, not England, would be the place he called home.
William Adams spent roughly 2 decades in Japan. During that time, his transformation was almost unbelievable. He had arrived as an exhausted sailor aboard the Liefde. He had been accused of piracy. He had been imprisoned. He had feared execution. Then everything changed. The Japanese ruler decided that the foreigners had committed no crime against Japan. Adams was released, but freedom did not take him home. Instead, his knowledge brought him closer to the Japanese court. He became useful as a navigator, shipbuilder, and advisor. He explained European countries and their ambitions. He helped the Japanese understand foreign ships and trade. And eventually, he received the status of a samurai. The foreign sailor became known as Miura Anjin. He married and built a life in Japan. He had found a new identity. Yet the memory of England remained. Adams knew he had been separated from his homeland by an enormous ocean. But by then, he had become deeply rooted in Japan. His story was no longer about returning home. It was about accepting the life that fate had given him. In 1620, William Adams died in Japan. He was around 55
years old. He had never returned to England. The man who had once sailed from Europe, searching for a route to the east, had spent the final years of his life in the country he had never intended to call home. His death marked the end of an extraordinary personal journey. But his story did not end there. The memory of the English navigator who became a Japanese samurai survived. His life became an example of how completely circumstances can transform a human being. He had entered Japan as a suspected criminal. He had stood before its ruler expecting judgment. Instead, he gained trust. He became an advisor,
he became a samurai. And finally, he became part of the country's history. His greatest achievement was not simply surviving. It was adapting. He crossed a cultural boundary few Europeans of his time could cross. And in doing so, he became a connection between two distant worlds. The story of William Adams sounds almost impossible. A sailor leaves Europe. He crosses the world. His ship reaches Japan almost destroyed. His companions are dying. His possessions are stolen. He is accused of piracy. Then he is imprisoned. For more than a month, he waits for a possible execution. And somehow, everything changes. The ruler decides to spare him. That single decision creates a completely different future. Adams becomes useful because he understands ships. He becomes trusted because he understands Europe. He becomes influential because
He can explain the outside world. And eventually, the foreign prisoner becomes a samurai. This transformation is what makes Adam's story so memorable. He did not conquer Japan. He did not arrive with an army. He arrived with almost nothing. His greatest weapon was knowledge. He understood the sea. He understood navigation. He understood European politics and trade. And he could communicate ideas between cultures. In an age when the world was still poorly understood, that knowledge was powerful. Adams became a rare human link between Europe and Japan. But his story is also about identity. Where did he belong? He was English by birth. He was Japanese by the life he created. His memories belonged partly to one world, while his future belonged to another. Perhaps that is why his story feels so emotional. He did not simply travel to another country. He lost one life and gained another. The Japan that initially frightened him eventually became the place where he built his family and reputation. The ruler who once held the power to execute him became the man who changed his destiny. And the ship that brought Adams to Japan became the beginning of a story far greater than its crew could have imagined. William Adams died in Japan. He never saw England again. But he left behind something more enduring than a voyage home. He left a story. A story about a man who survived when he should have died. A man who became powerful when he should have remained a prisoner. And a stranger who became part of a country that was once completely unknown to him. Imagine William Adams standing on the Japanese shore in April 1600. He has survived a nightmare at sea. His ship is damaged. His companions are sick. He has almost nothing. He does not know the language. He does not understand the customs. And he has no idea that the ruler of this distant country may soon decide whether he lives or dies. If someone had told Adams at that moment what the future held, he might never have believed it. He would not die on a Japanese execution round. He would not simply sail away after making a trade agreement. Instead, he would remain. He would gain the trust of Japan's ruler. He would advise the court. He would work with ships and navigation. He would help explain the mysterious world of Europe. He would receive a Japanese name. He would become a samurai. He would marry and establish a family. And he would eventually die in Japan in 1620. The sailor who crossed the world never returned to the land where his journey began. That is the greatest twist in his story. Adams went looking for a commercial opportunity. Fate gave him an entirely different life. He entered Japan as He became a prisoner. He escaped death. He became an advisor, then a samurai, and finally, a permanent part of Japanese history. His story proves how quickly destiny can change. One accusation could have ended his life. One decision
saved it. One skill, his knowledge of the sea, opened the door to a new world. And one unexpected relationship changed everything that followed. William Adams did not choose Japan as his final destination, but sometimes the most important destinations are the ones we never choose. He crossed the oceans, searching for the East. He found a country he had never imagined. He lost the life he knew. He gained another. And when his extraordinary journey finally ended, the English sailor was no longer simply a man from across the sea. He had become Miura Anjin, a foreigner, a samurai, a navigator, a bridge between civilizations, and a man whose greatest adventure began only after he thought his journey was already over. He sailed toward Japan, searching for a new world. He found a new life, and he never sailed home.